The morning sun had barely peeked over the horizon when Mrs. Thompson pulled into the parking lot of Fire Station 47. Her credentials spoke volumes: 15 years of experience as a fire safety inspector, multiple commendations for her work in improving emergency response protocols, and a master's degree in public safety administration. Yet, as she stepped out of her car, straightening her navy blue uniform, she couldn't shake the flutter of nervousness in her stomach. This wasn't just another job. As the first black female supervisor at Station 47, she knew she was stepping into uncharted territory. The station had a reputation, both for its excellent response times and its traditional mindset. She'd heard the whispers during her interview process, seen the sideways glances, but she didn't let it deter her. Change had to start somewhere. Walking through the station's heavy doors, Mrs. Thompson carried herself with quiet confidence. The morning shift was just starting, and the common area was filled with firefighters preparing for their day. As she entered, the casual chatter died down, replaced by a thick silence that spoke volumes. Chief Richards, a gray-haired veteran with tired eyes, met her at the entrance. "Mrs. Thompson," he nodded, his tone professionally neutral. "Welcome to Station 47, he gestured toward the group of firefighters. "The morning crew is just getting started with equipment checks." As she followed the chief through the station, Mrs. Thompson noticed how the firefighters quickly found reasons to look busy. Some buried their heads in equipment checks, others suddenly remembered urgent tasks in other rooms. Only a few met her eyes, and fewer still offered even a cursory greeting. During the morning briefing, Mrs. Thompson stood at the front with Chief Richards, presenting her new role and responsibilities. Her voice remained steady and clear as she outlined her plans for updated safety protocols and inspection schedules. 20 pairs of eyes stared back at her, some curious, others challenging, and a few deliberately indifferent. "I'm looking forward to working with all of you," she concluded, meeting their gazes one by one. "My door is always open for questions or concerns." The response was a mixture of half-hearted nods and mumbled acknowledgments. As the firefighters filed out, she overheard snippets of conversation that made her heart sink. "Since when do we need a safety inspector micromanaging us? Been doing this job for 20 years without someone looking over my shoulder. Bet she's never even seen a real fire up close." Later that morning, as Mrs. Thompson settled into her new office, a converted storage room with flickering fluorescent lights and a desk that had seen better days, she found her first welcome gift. A coffee mug left on her desk, filled with water that had long since gone cold. Written on a sticky note attached to it was a message that made her blood boil: "Maybe you'd be more comfortable inspecting a library." She picked up the mug, studied it for a moment, then calmly walked to the break room. The few firefighters present watched as she washed it thoroughly, dried it, and placed it on the communal shelf. Turning to face them, she smiled warmly. "Thanks for the coffee mug. I prefer tea, actually, but it's always good to have extra mugs around the station." Their stunned expressions almost made her laugh. Almost. As she walked back to her office, Mrs. Thompson pulled out her phone and looked at the photo of a young man in an impeccable uniform, her greatest pride and joy, though no one at the station needed to know about him just yet. His recent appointment would certainly make things interesting, but for now she had work to do. She opened her laptop and began reviewing the station's safety records, a small smile playing on her lips. They thought they could break her with cold shoulders and petty pranks. She'd built her career on turning hostile environments into opportunities for change. Station 47 wouldn't be any different, they just didn't know it yet. 2 weeks into her new role at Station 47, Mrs. Thompson started noticing a pattern. Every morning, she'd find her inspection schedules mysteriously rearranged on the bulletin board. Equipment she'd marked for maintenance would suddenly appear fixed, without any paperwork. Her emails about safety violations went unanswered, lost in the digital void of server issues. But it was the little things that really told the story. The way certain firefighters would stop talking when she entered the break room. How her parking spot always seemed to be accidentally blocked by maintenance vehicles. The constant misplacing of her reports, which meant she had to rewrite them, sometimes 2 or 3 times. One particularly challenging morning, she arrived to find her office door wouldn't open. The lock had been stuffed with something, probably paper clips, given the scratching sound when she tried her key. Rather than make a scene, she simply walked to the maintenance closet, grabbed some tools, and fixed it herself. She could feel eyes watching her from around corners, waiting for her to crack, to complain, to give them a reason to say she couldn't handle the job. Need any help with that? It was Lieutenant Parker, one of the few firefighters who actually looked her in the eye during conversations. He stood in the hallway, concern evident on his weathered face. "Almost got it," Mrs. Thompson replied, her voice steady as she worked. "Did you know I put myself through college working as a locksmith? Life has a funny way of teaching you useful skills." The lieutenant's surprised chuckle echoed down the hallway. "You're full of surprises, aren't you?" Before she could respond, the station alarm blared. Within seconds, the halls filled with a controlled chaos of firefighters rushing to their equipment. Mrs. Thompson stepped aside, watching as they moved with practiced precision. Structure fire at the old paper mill. The dispatcher's voice crackled over the speakers. Multiple floors involved. Mrs. Thompson frowned. She'd inspected that building last week and submitted a report about numerous safety violations. A report that had conveniently disappeared from Chief Richards' desk. As the trucks pulled out, she headed straight to her computer and pulled up her backup files she'd learned early in her career to keep digital copies of everything. There it was, her detailed report about the paper mill's faulty sprinkler system, blocked emergency exits, and dangerous chemical storage practices. She was printing a fresh copy when Officer Chen from the night shift rushed in. "Mrs. Thompson, you need to see this. They're refusing to follow the evacuation protocol you established." Grabbing her safety vest and the report, Mrs. Thompson hurried to her car. The drive to the paper mill took 7 minutes, 7 minutes during which her mind raced through every detail of that building's layout, every violation she documented, every safety measure that had been ignored. Arriving at the scene, she found chaos. Thick black smoke poured from the upper windows, and firefighters were preparing to enter through the main entrance, exactly where she'd noted structural concerns. "Chief Richards," she called out, running toward the command center with her report in hand. "The main entrance isn't safe. The support beams." "Mrs. Thompson, this is an active scene," he cut her off sharply. "We don't have time for your paperwork right now." "Sir, with all due respect, that entrance is—" A loud crack interrupted her words, followed by the sickening sound of groaning metal. Everyone watched in horror as the main entrance archway began to buckle. "Everyone out," Mrs. Thompson shouted, her voice carrying across the scene with unexpected authority. "Use the east service entrance. There's a clear path through the loading dock." For a moment, nobody moved. Then Lieutenant Parker's voice rang out. "You heard her. East entrance now." The firefighters redirected just as the main entrance collapsed, sending a shower of sparks and debris across the area they'd been standing in moments before. Chief Richards stared at the fallen archway, his face pale. Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, holding out her report. "Sir, I understand you're in command here, but there are 12 other critical points in that building that could fail just like that entrance did. If you'll let me, I can help make sure everyone makes it home today." The chief looked at her, then at the report, then back at the burning building. Something shifted in his expression, not quite acceptance, but perhaps the beginning of respect. "Talk to me," he said finally, taking the report from her hands. And for the first time since she'd started at Station 47, someone actually listened. As the sun rose higher in the sky, casting long shadows through the smoke, Mrs. Thompson stood at the command center, working side by side with the same people who'd tried so hard to push her away. They had a long way to go, but maybe, just maybe, this was a start. What they didn't know was that she'd sent a copy of her original paper mill report up the chain of command the day she wrote it. And somewhere in the city, a young man in a commissioner's uniform was reading it very carefully indeed. The paper mill incident should have changed things at Station 47. For a few days, it seemed like it had. Some firefighters actually nodded to Mrs. Thompson in the hallways. Lieutenant Parker even invited her to join them for coffee one morning. But old habits die hard, and soon enough, the resistance returned, this time with a vengeance. It started with whispers about how she'd overstepped her bounds at the paper mill, how she'd undermined the chain of command. Never mind that her actions had prevented injuries. To some, she was still an outsider who needed to learn her place. One morning, she arrived to find her entire filing cabinet had been reorganized. Months of carefully documented safety reports were now scattered and mixed up, some even stained with coffee. As she stood there, staring at the mess, she heard snickering from the hallway. "Everything all right, Mrs. Thompson?" Chief Richards asked, appearing in her doorway. "Just a little filing mishap," she replied calmly, already starting to sort through the papers. "Nothing I can't handle." The chief lingered for a moment, his expression unreadable. "You know, nobody would blame you if you wanted to transfer to another station. Somewhere more accommodating." Mrs. Thompson straightened up, meeting his gaze. "With all due respect, sir, I don't run from challenges. Never have, never will." Before he could respond, the station alarm blared again. This time, it was a massive fire at the city's largest warehouse complex. As the trucks rolled out, Mrs. Thompson noticed something odd. They were taking Engine 3, which she'd flagged for brake maintenance just yesterday. She rushed to the radio room. "Dispatch, this is Safety Inspector Thompson. Engine 3 needs to be recalled immediately." "The brake system." "Sorry, ma'am," the dispatcher cut in. "They're already en route. Besides, the maintenance log shows Engine 3 was cleared for service this morning." Mrs. Thompson's blood ran cold. She'd seen the brake fluid leak herself, and no mechanic had been scheduled until next week. Someone had falsified the maintenance log. She grabbed her keys and jumped into her car, her heart pounding. The warehouse was 15 minutes away, 15 minutes too long. As she drove, she called the city's emergency management office, reporting the situation. Then she did something she'd hoped she wouldn't have to do. She called a private number, one that could change everything. Arriving at the warehouse, she found a scene straight out of her worst nightmares. The fire had spread to 3 buildings, and Engine 3 was positioned at the far end of the complex. As she watched, the engine tried to back up to a better position, and the brakes failed. The massive truck rolled backward, straight toward a group of firefighters directing water at the blaze. Time seemed to slow down as Mrs. Thompson sprinted forward, her voice rising above the chaos. "Move, brake failure. Clear the area." The firefighters scattered just in time. Engine 3 crashed into a stack of empty shipping containers with a deafening crunch. In the ensuing silence, broken only by the crackle of flames, Mrs. Thompson marched straight to Chief Richards. "Sir, I have documentation proving Engine 3 was flagged for critical brake maintenance yesterday. Someone cleared it for service without repairs. This could have killed people." The chief's face darkened. "That's a serious accusation, Mrs. Thompson." "It's not an accusation, sir. It's a fact. And I've got copies of every falsified maintenance log, every ignored safety report, and every incident of harassment from the past 3 months right here." She pulled out her tablet, displaying file after file of meticulously documented evidence. "You've been spying on my station?" The chief's voice rose dangerously. "No, sir. I've been doing my job. Protecting lives, including the lives of people who'd rather see me quit than admit I might actually know what I'm talking about." A sleek black SUV pulled up to the scene, and a tall figure in a commissioner's uniform stepped out. Several firefighters straightened up immediately, recognition dawning on their faces. "I believe," Mrs. Thompson said quietly, "the fire commissioner would be very interested in seeing these reports, especially since one of them just nearly got his mother killed." The stunned silence that followed was broken only by the approaching footsteps of the commissioner, Mrs. Thompson's son, his face a mask of controlled anger as he surveyed the scene. The truth was finally about to come out, and Station 47 would never be the same again. The warehouse complex crackled with burning embers as the fire commissioner strode toward the gathered firefighters. His presence commanded instant attention, not just because of his rank, but because of the striking resemblance he bore to a certain safety inspector. The same determined set of the jaw, the same unwavering gaze. "Would someone like to explain," he said, his voice carrying across the scene, "why Engine 3 was cleared for service despite a documented brake system failure?" Nobody spoke. The only sounds were the hiss of water hitting hot metal and the distant wail of backup units arriving. "I've got plenty to say, Commissioner." Mrs. Thompson stepped forward, tablet in hand. 3 months' worth, actually. Several firefighters shifted uncomfortably as they finally made the connection. The safety inspector they'd been harassing was the commissioner's mother. The woman they tried to drive out, whose reports they'd lost, whose warnings they'd ignored, she could have ended their careers dozens of times over. Instead, she kept doing her job, protecting even those who'd tried to undermine her. The commissioner took the tablet, his expression growing darker as he scrolled through the files. "Chief Richards, your office." Now, he looked up at the gathered crew. "Lieutenant Parker, take command of the scene. The rest of you, back to work. We'll deal with this situation later." As the firefighters dispersed, some threw guilty glances at Mrs. Thompson. Others looked angry, but their anger now seemed tinged with shame. Lieutenant Parker caught her eye and gave her a small nod, one that seemed to say both "I'm sorry" and "thank you." Inside the chief's makeshift command office, a converted storage container at the edge of the complex, the air was thick with tension. Mrs. Thompson sat straight-backed in her chair as her son laid out document after document on the folding table. Falsified maintenance logs, ignored safety protocols, systematic harassment. The commissioner's voice was controlled but fierce. And now, a near-fatal accident. "Chief Richards, this isn't just unprofessional, it's criminal negligence." The chief, who'd been standing by the window, turned to face them. His face had aged 10 years in the past hour. "Commissioner, I take full responsibility." "No," Mrs. Thompson interrupted, surprising both men. "You don't get to fall on your sword, Chief, not alone anyway." She stood up, straightening her safety vest. "This isn't about one person, it's about a culture. A culture that values tradition over safety, comfort over progress, and pride over protection. And changing that culture is exactly why I came to Station 47. The commissioner looked at his mother with a mix of pride and concern. "Mom, they could have killed you today." "But they didn't," she replied firmly. "And now they know better. The question is, what are we going to do to make sure this never happens again?" "At any station." The chief sank into his chair, looking defeated. "I suppose you'll want my resignation." "Actually," Mrs. Thompson said, pulling up another file on her tablet, "I have a different proposal." She turned the screen so both men could see it, a comprehensive plan for departmental reform. New training protocols, accountability measures, and most importantly, a mentorship program designed to break down the barriers that had led to this crisis. "I didn't spend 3 months documenting problems without thinking about solutions," she explained. "Station 47 isn't unique, it's just a symptom of a larger issue. But it could also be the start of real change." The commissioner studied the proposal, his professional mask softening slightly. "You knew this day would come, didn't you? You've been planning for it all along." "I knew something would break eventually," she replied. "I just hoped it would be prejudices rather than brake lines." Chief Richards leaned forward, reading the proposal with new interest. This could actually work. But the old guard won't like it. "The old guard nearly got people killed today," the commissioner stated flatly. "I think they've lost their right to object." Mrs. Thompson held up her hand. "With respect, Commissioner, that's exactly the kind of attitude we need to avoid. This isn't about punishment, it's about transformation. Everyone needs to be part of the solution or it won't stick." For the first time that day, a hint of a smile crossed the chief's face. "You know, Mrs. Thompson, when you first arrived, I thought you were here to tear us down. But you're actually trying to build us up, aren't you?" "That's been the plan all along, Chief." "That's been the plan all along." Outside, the warehouse fire was finally under control. As the smoke began to clear, it revealed a new day dawning, not just for Station 47, but for the entire department. The old way of doing things had nearly cost lives today. Now it was time for change, ready or not. The week following the warehouse incident felt like the longest in Station 47's history. Every firefighter, from veterans to rookies, had to face a formal review board. The conference room at headquarters became a place of reckoning as years of buried incidents came to light. Mrs. Thompson sat through each session, not as an accuser but as a witness. She watched as tough, proud firefighters finally spoke their truths. Some broke down in tears, admitting how they'd stayed silent while watching others being mistreated. Others defended their actions at first, only to have their excuses crumble under the weight of evidence. "I didn't think it was that serious," one veteran firefighter admitted, staring at his hands. "The pranks, the comments, it was just how things had always been done." "And the maintenance logs?" the review board chairperson asked. Was falsifying safety documents also just how things were done? The silence that followed was deafening. Lieutenant Parker's testimony proved particularly powerful. "I knew what was happening was wrong," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "I tried to be nice to Mrs. Thompson, thought that made up for not stopping others from harassing her. But being polite while watching discrimination happen, that's just cowardice wearing a smile." The stories kept coming. A junior firefighter revealed how she'd been told to keep quiet about inappropriate comments or risk being branded a troublemaker. A mechanic admitted to feeling pressured to sign off on unsafe equipment because that's what the guys wanted. Chief Richards faced the longest review. For 6 hours, he answered questions about every incident, every ignored report, every time he looked the other way. By the end, he looked exhausted but somehow lighter, as if letting go of a heavy burden. "I failed as a leader," he concluded. "I let my station become a place where some people felt entitled to hurt others, where safety took a backseat to ego, where good people stayed quiet because speaking up carried too high a price." The commissioner, who had been silent through most of the proceedings, finally spoke. "The question now is, what are we going to do about it?" That's when Mrs. Thompson stepped forward with her expanded reform plan. The room fell silent as she laid out her vision for transformation. First, she began, mandatory retraining for everyone, not just at Station 47, but across the department. Not the usual PowerPoint presentations about policies, but real conversations about respect, safety, and accountability. She clicked to the next slide. Second, a new mentorship program. Every station will pair experienced firefighters with newcomers from different backgrounds. The goal isn't just to teach firefighting skills, but to build understanding across differences. The presentation continued, each point addressing both immediate concerns and long-term cultural change. By the end, even the most skeptical board members were nodding. "This won't be easy," she acknowledged. "Change never is. But look at what keeping things the same has cost us, not just in terms of safety violations or potential lawsuits, but in human terms. How many good people have we lost because they didn't fit someone's idea of what a firefighter should look like?" One by one, people started volunteering to help implement the reforms. The same firefighters who had once tried to drive Mrs. Thompson away now asked to be part of her training team. Even Chief Richards requested to help, though he'd been suspended from active duty pending final review. "I want to make this right," he said quietly during a break. "Not just for the department, but for everyone I failed to protect." The commissioner watched all of this with growing appreciation for his mother's approach. She hadn't come seeking revenge or punishment, she'd come to build something better. When others might have swung the hammer of authority, she'd chosen to extend a hand of opportunity. As the sun set on the final day of reviews, Mrs. Thompson stood at the window of the conference room, watching the city lights come on. Behind her, people were still discussing implementation plans, sharing ideas, showing the kind of enthusiasm that comes with genuine commitment to change. "You know," Lieutenant Parker said, joining her at the window, "when you first started documenting everything, we thought you were building a case against us." Mrs. Thompson smiled. "I was building a case, just not the kind you thought. I was building a case for change, real change, the kind that lasts because people choose it for themselves." Outside, a fire engine's siren wailed in the distance. Another crew heading out to help people in need. Another chance to prove that doing the right thing, both in firefighting and in treating people with dignity, wasn't just a policy to follow, but a choice to make every single day. 3 months after the warehouse incident, Station 47 looked different. Not just on the surface, though the fresh paint and reorganized spaces helped, but in ways that really mattered. The change was visible in small moments, like the morning Mrs. Thompson walked into the kitchen to find a group of firefighters actually arguing about who had organized the equipment lockers better. "Your system makes no sense," one of them said, waving a clipboard. "Color coding is fine, but we need to factor in response time too." "That's exactly what I was thinking," Mrs. Thompson chimed in, unable to hide her smile. These were the same firefighters who'd once reorganized her files to make her job harder. Now they were debating the best way to improve efficiency. The biggest test of their transformation came during a massive apartment complex fire. As trucks pulled up to the scene, Every firefighter immediately checked in with Mrs. Thompson, who had arrived minutes earlier to assess the structure. "East stairwells compromised," she reported, pointing to her tablet. "Recent renovation work weakened the support beams. West and north access points are your best options." "Copy that," said the crew chief, who happened to be one of her former biggest critics. Without hesitation, he redirected his team to the safer entry points. No argument, no wounded pride, just professional respect that put safety first. The fire was challenging, with multiple floors involved and several residents trapped on upper levels. But the new protocols, the ones that some had once mocked as excessive paperwork, proved their worth. Every firefighter knew exactly where to go, what to watch for, and how to communicate concerns. During the operation, Mrs. Thompson noticed something that made her throat tight with emotion. The firefighters were working in pairs, one veteran with one rookie, just as her mentorship program had suggested. But they'd taken it further than she'd imagined. Each pair represented different backgrounds, different experiences, different perspectives. They moved like they'd been working together for years, not months. "Watch your left," called out a veteran firefighter to his partner as they navigated a smoke-filled hallway. This same veteran had once been part of the group that tried to intimidate Mrs. Thompson into quitting. Now here he was, protecting his younger colleague with genuine concern. The rescue operation succeeded without a single injury to civilians or firefighters. As the teams regrouped outside, Mrs. Thompson overheard snippets of conversation that would have been unimaginable just months ago. "Great catch on that hidden gas line. Thanks for backing me up when I spotted the structural issue. Hey, you okay? That was a rough one. Want to talk about it?" Later that evening, during the incident debrief, something extraordinary happened. The crew chief stood up and addressed the room. "I owe everyone an apology," he began, his voice rough with emotion. "Especially you, Mrs. Thompson. I was wrong. Dead wrong. Not just about the safety protocols, but about everything. I thought being a good firefighter was about being tough, about tradition. But it's about being smart, being careful, and most importantly, being human." The room fell silent. Mrs. Thompson felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes, but she held them back. This wasn't about her, it was about something much bigger. "Today proved it," he continued. "We saved more lives because we listened to each other, because we put safety first, because we finally understood that different perspectives make us stronger, not weaker." One by one, other firefighters started sharing their own reflections. Stories of how the changes had improved their work, their relationships, their lives. Even the most resistant members of the old guard had to admit that the station was running better than ever. The commissioner, who had dropped by to observe the operation, stood quietly in the back of the room. His mother had done more than fix a broken station. She'd shown an entire department how to become better, not through force or fear, but through persistence, professionalism, and an unwavering belief in people's capacity to change. As the meeting wound down, Lieutenant Parker approached Mrs. Thompson with a curious request. "We've been thinking," he said, gesturing to the group. "Would you consider teaching at the academy? Not just about safety protocols, but about all of this, about how to build a department that works for everyone." Mrs. Thompson looked around the room, at the faces that had once shown contempt but now showed respect, at the teams that had formed across every kind of divide, at the proof that change was possible when people chose to embrace it. "I think," she said carefully, "that we all have something to teach each other. And yes, I'd be honored to help share these lessons, but only if we do it together." The night shift was arriving as the day crew prepared to head home. In the past, shift changes had been tense, minimal affairs. Now, crews took time to properly brief each other, share concerns, check on equipment together. The station hummed with the energy of people who weren't just doing a job, but building something meaningful. As Mrs. Thompson gathered her things to leave, she found a new mug on her desk. This one was filled with her favorite tea, still hot, with a note that read, "Thank you for not giving up on us." 1 year after Mrs. Thompson first walked through the doors of Station 47, she stood in front of a packed auditorium at the city's fire academy. Behind her, a screen displayed photographs of diverse firefighting crews working together, statistics showing improved safety records, and testimonials from department members whose lives had been changed. When I first started as a safety inspector at Station 47, she began, her voice carrying across the silent room. Someone left a cold cup of water on my desk with a note suggesting I might be more comfortable in a library. She paused, letting that sink in. Today, that same person helps run our mentorship program for new recruits. Gentle laughter rippled through the audience. In the front row, several familiar faces from Station 47 smiled, including the very firefighter she'd mentioned. This isn't just a story about one station's transformation, Mrs. Thompson continued. It's about what happens when we dare to challenge the way things have always been done. When we choose growth over comfort, inclusion over tradition, and most importantly, when we realize that safety isn't just about equipment and protocols, it's about creating an environment where everyone can do their best work. The presentation that followed wasn't just about numbers, though those were impressive enough. Response times had improved by 30%. Workplace injuries had dropped to their lowest level in department history. Staff retention was up, especially among minority and female firefighters. But the real story was in the details she shared. The veteran firefighter who'd once led the resistance against her now requested her presence at every major operation, saying, "I sleep better knowing she's checked everything twice." The young rookie who'd been afraid to report harassment was now leading workshops on communication and workplace respect with full support from senior staff. The mechanic who'd been pressured to falsify maintenance logs had established a new system of anonymous safety reporting that was being adopted by departments across the state. Even Chief Richards, who'd recently returned from his suspension, had become an unexpected champion for change. He traveled to other stations, sharing their story as a warning and a promise. A warning about the cost of allowing discrimination to fester, and a promise that transformation was possible. As Mrs. Thompson wrapped up her presentation, she shared one final story that brought tears to many eyes. Last week, a young girl came to visit Station 47 with the school. When she saw me working alongside the crew, her eyes got big and she asked, "Can girls be firefighters too?" Before I could answer, every single member of the crew jumped in to tell her yes and to share stories about the amazing women they worked with. She paused, letting the impact of that moment settle. But what really got me was what happened next. This little girl looked at the crew, men and women of different races, ages, backgrounds, all working together, all respecting each other. And she said something so simple but so powerful, "This is what heroes look like." The auditorium erupted in applause. As it died down, Mrs. Thompson delivered her final message. Change isn't easy, it's not comfortable. Sometimes it takes someone refusing to back down in the face of resistance. Sometimes it takes a crisis to open our eyes. But mostly, it takes everyday heroes, people willing to admit they were wrong, to learn new ways of thinking, to stand up for what's right even when it's hard. She gestured to her colleagues from Station 47. These are those heroes, not because they're perfect, they'll be the first to tell you they're not, but because they proved that it's never too late to change, never too late to grow, never too late to build something better. The commissioner stood up first, leading a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. As people began to file out afterward, Mrs. Thompson found herself surrounded by firefighters from other stations, all eager to learn how they could implement similar changes. Later that evening, back at Station 47, the crew surprised her with a small celebration. The break room was decorated with a hand-painted banner that read, "Thank you for making us better." On a table sat a familiar mug, the very one that had once held that cold cup of water, now filled with her favorite tea and surrounded by dozens of notes of gratitude. As she looked around at the faces of people who had become not just colleagues but family, Mrs. Thompson realized something profound. The story of Station 47 wasn't just about overcoming racism or discrimination. It was about the extraordinary things that become possible when people choose to see each other's humanity, when they have the courage to face uncomfortable truths, and when they work together to build something better than what was there before. The station alarm sounded, and without missing a beat, everyone moved to their positions. Mrs. Thompson watched with pride as the crew responded, efficient, professional, united. They had become exactly what she'd always known they could be, not just a great firefighting unit, but a model of what was possible when people chose to change. As the trucks pulled out, their sirens echoing into the night, she smiled, knowing that the real victory wasn't just in changing one station, but in showing the world that change was possible anywhere people were brave enough to try.